I was halfway through replacing the brake pads on my truck when I spotted the envelope taped to my front door. Big red letters across the top, Notice of Violation HOA Enforcement. My gut told me exactly who was behind it before I even opened it, Karen Sheffield. The HOA board president with a voice like a smoke detector and the personality of a root canal. I tore it open with greasy hands. Violation of Article 7, Section 3, Visible Yard Debris. Immediate fine of $150. Below that was a blurry photo of a crumpled fast food bag and an empty soda cup sitting at the edge of my lawn, barely touching the grass. I stood there staring at it, dumbfounded. "You've got to be kidding me," I muttered. Now I live on the corner lot. Wind hits our street hard, especially after trash day. Everyone's garbage ends up where it wants. I walk my yard twice a week just to keep it clean. But this was a setup. I didn't even have to guess where it came from. Karen lived 2 houses up, and her overflowing recycling bin had been open like a buffet for the wind that morning. I walked over to the side of the house and rewound the footage from the security cameras I'd installed 6 months ago after Karen tried to fine me for excessive car noise when my cousin started his Harley once. There it was, plain as daylight. Time-stamped, 23 minutes after the garbage truck rolled by. Karen's blue recycling bin tipped sideways and a gust of wind scooped out a paper bag, 2 cups, and a napkin. They flew straight down the street and landed exactly where she'd photographed them. I paused the footage and took a picture of the screen with my phone. My blood was boiling, but I wasn't going to yell. No, I was going to play this perfectly. I walked up to her house and rang the doorbell. She opened the door wearing a cardigan, pearls, and that permanent expression like she'd just smelled something bad. "Russell Whittaker," she said, arms crossed. "I assume you're here about the fine. I suggest you read the bylaws." I held up my phone. "Before you finish that sentence, you might want to watch this." She squinted at the video for 2 seconds before her eyes widened. She reached out toward the phone. "Nope," I said, pulling it back. "That's your trash, Karen, your bin, your wind." She opened her mouth, then closed it. Her face flushed a deep shade of beet red. I didn't know. You knew exactly what you were doing," I said, locking eyes with her. "You took a photo of trash that came from your yard and tried to fine me for it." "It was a mistake," she said quickly. "I'll withdraw the fine." I smiled, not because it was over, but because I knew it wasn't. I'd already seen her name on at least 3 other notices taped to my neighbors' doors this week. Same kind of photos, same kind of trash. I nodded slowly. "Oh, I'm sure you will. And I'm sure the rest of the board will want to see this footage too, especially when I bring it up at the next meeting." Her face dropped like a brick. "You're not the only one with cameras, Karen," I added, turning to walk away. "And something tells me you've been making a lot of mistakes lately." The next HOA board meeting was scheduled for Thursday evening in the community clubhouse, the same beige stucco building where they hosted holiday potlucks and mandatory landscaping workshops. I arrived 10 minutes early, laptop under my arm, and took a seat in the second row. The board sat in their usual half-circle of folding tables up front, with Karen in the center, flanked by her 2 most loyal companions. Dennis Withrow, who managed the neighborhood's finances with all the warmth of a tax audit, and Bonnie Fields, who once tried to ban inflatable holiday decorations because she claimed Santa Claus was a symbol of unchecked capitalism. Karen didn't acknowledge me when I entered. Her eyes were glued to the agenda in front of her, jaw tight. But I noticed the slight tremble in her hand as she adjusted her glasses. She knew I wasn't here to take notes. As more neighbors trickled in, I spotted Mrs. Callahan from across the street and gave her a nod. She waved back, and I saw she had her own manila folder in hand. So did Daniel and Patris from 2 houses down. Each carried the same weary look, like people who'd been pushed too far and finally decided they weren't going to take it anymore. The meeting opened with the usual droning pleasantries. Karen cleared her throat and began reading off landscaping violations and noise complaints like she was delivering a weather report. I let her get through 6 items before I stood up, laptop already open to the exact timestamp. Before we move any further, I said, loud enough to stop her mid-sentence, I'd like to present evidence of misconduct by this board. Karen blinked. Excuse me? I turned the screen toward the audience. I have video proof that a citation issued to me this week was based on false pretenses. This footage shows trash originating from the board president's own property landing on mine minutes before I was fined for it. A low murmur spread across the room as I hit play. The video was short, barely 30 seconds, but the impact was immediate. People leaned forward. You could hear the shift in the room like a change in barometric pressure. Bonnie's eyes flicked to Karen. Dennis adjusted his collar. That could have been any recycling bin, Karen said quickly, her voice rising. It's not, it's blue with a white crack on the right panel, I cut in. Same exact bin you've had since the city replaced them last March. And I already compared the wind pattern that day to the direction of movement in the video. It's indisputable. I believe this is outside the scope of actually, said Mr. Delgado from the back row. If board members are targeting residents with false violations, that's very much within the scope of this meeting. Karen hesitated. If you have a concern, you can submit it in writing. There's a process. No, said Patris, standing up. I tried your process. Twice. Got ignored both times, but I have photos of my own and I'd like to share them. She walked to the front and pulled out a printed sheet showing a pile of garden trimmings by her fence right next to a drainage grate. I was fined for improper disposal of yard waste, but look here, my security camera caught someone moving the clippings there while I was at work. She held up another photo. That's Bonnie, clear as day. Bonnie's mouth dropped open. Someone must have used my gloves. Patris didn't even look at her. I filed an appeal, never heard back, just got a second notice with a late fee tacked on. The room erupted. One by one, neighbors stood up to air their grievances. Some had emails that were never returned. Others had violations for things that didn't exist, non-existent weeds, phantom noise complaints, and one absurd case where a man was fined for leaving his porch light on past midnight. Karen tried to regain control. We're getting off topic. This is not a trial, I stepped forward. You're right, Karen, it's not a trial, but it might become one, she froze. I pulled a printed report from my folder. Over the past 4 months, this board has issued over 60 fines totaling more than $11,000. But when I cross-referenced the violations with city records, I found that 12 of those properties had never received prior warnings, which violates municipal code. Dennis shifted uncomfortably. Moreover, I continued, 3 of those fines were followed by liens on the properties in under 30 days. That's illegal under state law. Minimum 60-day notice required. I've already filed a complaint with the Department of Consumer Affairs. And I'm preparing a report for the county attorney's office. Bonnie stood abruptly. You're exaggerating. This is all just a misunderstanding. I'd be happy to let the DA decide that, I said. Karen's eyes darted across the room, scanning for support. She found none, then Mrs. Callahan raised her hand. I checked the HOA's financial statements. You paid a private contractor to audit properties last month, but I looked up the contractor's name. It's your nephew. Karen's face drained of color. And he's not licensed, Mrs. Callahan added. Just applied for an LLC 3 weeks ago. That was the final crack in the dam. You've been pocketing fine money, someone shouted. Where's the transparency? Why are we paying dues if they're being funneled to your family? Karen tried to speak, but her words were drowned out by the rising tide of voices. I raised my hand. Order, we need a motion. Mr. Delgado stood. I moved to suspend Karen Sheffield from her role as board president pending investigation. I second it, said Patris. All in favor? I asked. Every hand went up, even Dennis's after a long pause. Karen stood rooted in place as the vote passed. Bonnie looked like she wanted to evaporate. The room buzzed with disbelief and relief all at once, As people began dispersing, I caught Dennis by the arm. "You knew something wasn't right, didn't you?" He nodded slowly. "I didn't have proof, and she controlled everything." "Well," I said, "now we do." Outside, the air felt different, lighter. Neighbors lingered in the parking lot, talking for once without suspicion or resentment. I walked back to my truck, laptop under one arm, and looked back at the clubhouse. It wasn't over yet. The investigation would take time. There'd be paperwork, statements, possibly even charges. But the board had been cracked wide open and the community wasn't afraid anymore. The wind picked up again as I reached my driveway. A single napkin skittered across the curb, caught it before it landed on the grass. Old habits. But this time, I knew no one would be using it as ammunition. Not anymore. It took less than a week for word to spread beyond our neighborhood. By the following Monday, a local news van was parked at the curb outside the clubhouse. A young reporter named Talia Ruiz stood under a tripod, adjusting her microphone with one hand and shielding her notes from the wind with the other. I didn't plan to talk to the press, but when she caught me loading lumber into my truck and asked if I was one of the residents who challenged the board, I didn't deny it. "Off the record," I said, brushing sawdust off my shirt, "this place was run like a private kingdom. People got fined for things that didn't exist. Records went missing, and someone's nephew got paid with our dues to spy on us." "You have documentation of that?" she asked, notepad ready. "I've got timestamps, receipts, and emails, and I'm not the only one." I didn't give her anything more. But I could tell that was plenty. Later that day, an unmarked sedan rolled up to the neighborhood. Two men in jackets got out, one with a clipboard, the other with a camera bag. They didn't bother knocking on doors. They walked straight to the HOA office inside the clubhouse. Karen wasn't there. Neither was Bonnie. But Dennis was, and when I passed by on my way back from the hardware store, I saw him through the window, handing over a file box with a look on his face like he'd just dropped a weight he'd been carrying for years. The next morning, a notice went up beside the mailboxes. It was from the County Fraud Investigations Unit. They were launching a formal inquiry into the HOA's financial practices. They asked any residents who had received sudden liens, unexplained warnings, or had paid unusually high fines to bring their documentation to a public hearing scheduled for the following week. By Thursday, we had a volunteer committee of neighbors compiling evidence. I lent them access to the footage archive from my cameras. Patris brought spreadsheets. Mrs. Callahan brought a binder thicker than a phone book. "It's all here," she said, flipping through color-coded tabs. Invoices, duplicate charges, even a payment to a landscaping service that doesn't exist. "Fake company, registered to a P.O. box in Nevada," she said, tapping the page. "Guess who opened that P.O. box?" I raised an eyebrow. "Bonnie's sister." At that point, it wasn't just about trash fines anymore. This had evolved into something bigger, something that reeked of embezzlement, bribery, and impersonation. The neighborhood had been bled dry slowly, stealthily, with fines as camouflage. The public hearing was held inside the municipal hall downtown. The chairs were plastic, the lighting was harsh, and the air smelled faintly of stale coffee. But the room was packed. Over 30 residents from our neighborhood showed up, some with folders, others with photos, and everyone with stories. A county investigator named Alina Morales led the proceedings. She didn't smile. She didn't blink much either. She just listened, asked pointed questions, and took notes with a pen that clicked like a metronome between testimonies. Karen didn't attend. Neither did Bonnie or the nephew. But Dennis showed up, sat in the front row, and when called, stepped to the podium like a man ready to purge something heavy. "I didn't know how bad it had gotten," he said, voice low. "At first it was little things, petty fines, a few extra dollars shuffled around. Then I saw payments going out to unfamiliar vendors. I asked questions. They were answered with silence or excuses. I'm not proud of staying quiet." Miss Morales didn't interrupt. She just nodded once when he finished. Patris spoke next, then Mrs. Callahan, Then a man named Ellis from the North cul-de-sac who'd had a lien placed on his home while he was recovering from surgery. He hadn't been able to mow his lawn. The HOA sent him a violation, then another, then filed a lien without warning. I almost lost my house because I chose between breathing and bending over to pull weeds, he said. By the end of the hearing, Miss Morales stood, closed her folder and said only, "We have sufficient cause to proceed with a formal investigation. Thank you for your cooperation." That was Friday. By Monday morning, 2 sheriff's vehicles pulled into our neighborhood around 7 o'clock. They didn't use sirens. They didn't have to. They went straight to Karen's house and knocked once. She opened the door in a bathrobe, looked at the badge, and stepped back without a word. The officers came out 15 minutes later with 2 boxes of files, a laptop, and a desktop tower wrapped in plastic. Karen followed, hands behind her back, her face pale and unreadable. They hit Bonnie's place next. She wasn't home. They taped a notice to her door and drove off. Later that day, the county posted a temporary suspension on the HOA board's authority. An interim management firm was appointed to oversee operations until a new board could be elected. Notices were sent out. Fines were frozen. Liens were halted. A forensic audit was ordered. That night, a few of us gathered in my garage, not to celebrate, just to breathe. "We should have seen this coming," said Ellis, sipping from a paper cup. "No," Patris said, shaking her head. "They counted on us thinking that way. That's what people like them do. They make you feel like complaining is pointless." Mrs. Callahan looked around. "What happens now?" I leaned against the workbench. "Now we rebuild from the ground up." Elections were scheduled for 3 weeks later. I didn't plan to run, but people kept asking. I finally agreed, but only with conditions. "I don't want power," I told them. "I want transparency, I want term limits, and if I ever find someone for a gum wrapper, I want you to throw me out." The ballots came in. I won by a landslide. So did Mrs. Callahan and Patris. Dennis didn't run, but he showed up to the swearing-in with a box of old records and an apology. At our first meeting, we passed a motion to install open access cameras in all board meetings. We published every financial transaction online. We eliminated third-party inspectors. And we wrote a clause into the bylaws requiring every warning to include a photo, timestamp, and a mandatory grace period before any fines could be issued. A month after that, the county released a report. Karen was charged with fraud, misuse of community funds, and tampering with financial records. Bonnie was charged as a co-conspirator. The nephew fled the state, but a warrant was issued for his arrest. Our neighborhood didn't go back to normal. It became something better. Neighbors started talking to each other again. People volunteered to help maintain the park. We had a block party for the first time in 5 years, and not one person brought up violations. The cameras in my yard still run. Not because I'm afraid, but because I believe in keeping receipts. And every now and then, when the wind kicks up and a napkin drifts across my lawn, I laugh. Not because it's funny, but because it reminds me how close we came to losing control and how we took it back with proof, with patience, and with a little bit of grit. And just like that, the trash that started it all became the thing that cleaned up everything. The morning after the new board took office, I found a manila envelope wedged under my welcome mat. No logo. No return address. Inside was a printed letter anonymous and a stack of photocopied invoices. The letter was short, typed in blocky font. "Check the dates. She's been doing this longer than anyone thinks. Someone needs to look at the community center storage closet." A friend I walked to the clubhouse with the envelope tucked under my arm. It was early and the parking lot was empty except for Patris's little red hybrid. She was inside, sorting out the new key logs and checking the utility bills for irregularities. When I showed her the papers, she scanned the pages, jaw tightening. "These are from before we even moved in," she said. "Look at the vendor names, same fake landscaping company, same P.O. box." "We need to see what's in that closet," I said. The storage closet was at the rear of the clubhouse, behind the old folding chairs and the rusted popcorn machine. The key had been missing for months. Karen always claimed it had been lost during a renovation. We'd assumed it held nothing but outdated decorations and maybe a few broken chairs. Dennis found the spare key in a lockbox buried under unrelated documents in the HOA office records that had been sealed under a confidential label by Karen herself. We opened the door just after noon. The first thing we saw were boxes, dozens of them, labeled in faint marker, organized by year. Inside were printed violation notices, copies of checks, and handwritten notes, some in pencil, others in ink. Most disturbing were the folders labeled flagged homes. Inside those were photos, hundreds, maybe thousands, taken from odd angles through shrubs over fences. Some were time-stamped at night, others were stapled to forms with notes like repeat offender, slow to comply, or possible sale in future. Patris pulled out a folder marked Whitaker. My name, my address. A map of my home drawn in pen with arrows and circles marking things like tool shed non-standard and truck parked at angle. There was even a sticky note, has cameras, be cautious. She looked at me. This wasn't enforcement, this was surveillance, we called the sheriff's office. By 4 that afternoon, the closet was sealed off with yellow tape and cataloged by 2 detectives and an evidence technician. The lead detective, a tall man named Rourke, asked to speak with us outside. You said the board president had access to this closet. She was the only one with a key, I said. Until we found the spare, he nodded slowly. Do you know if she ever tried to purchase homes in the neighborhood? Patris and I glanced at each other. I don't, I said. But she was involved in every foreclosure meeting. She always insisted on handling those personally. Rourke looked down at his notepad. We've got reason to believe she may have been using violations to target specific properties that were behind on payments. Stack up fines, issue liens, and when the homeowner defaulted, she'd push for the HOA to purchase the property at auction. For what? Patris asked. She has a holding company registered under a different name. That same company owns 7 homes in this zip code. All were acquired through lien-triggered foreclosures. All had prior ties to this HOA. My chest tightened. She was manufacturing violations to take people's homes. She was flipping them, Rourke confirmed, renting some, selling others. We're still tracking the paper trail, but it looks like she made well over $400,000 in the last 18 months. Patris leaned against the brick wall. We thought it was about control, but it was greed. We're filing charges, Rourke said. Wire fraud, racketeering, unlawful surveillance, and potentially conspiracy to commit property theft. The next day, the story made the evening news. This time, the anchor used Karen's full name and included a booking photo from the county jail. The footage showed her in cuffs being led into a courthouse. Calm, cold. Like she still thought she would talk her way out of it, but the evidence was overwhelming. Between the anonymous documents, the storage closet, and the financial records uncovered during the audit, the DA's office had everything they needed. At the preliminary hearing, I sat in the back row of the courtroom beside Patris and Mrs. Callahan. The judge read off the charges one by one: 18 counts of fraud, 6 of illegal property acquisition, 5 of falsifying documents, and 3 of stalking. Bonnie's name appeared on several of the same counts. Karen's attorney tried to argue that the board had discretionary authority, but the judge didn't buy it. Not when the prosecution played a video of Karen coaching her nephew on how to document violations without being seen. It had been found on an old phone in the storage closet, buried under a pile of faux violation letters. She was denied bail. After the hearing, reporters swarmed the courthouse steps. I didn't stop this time. I took the mic and told them exactly what happened, not just the crimes, but how easy it had been for her to weaponize a system that was supposed to protect property values, not destroy homes. She used the HOA as a shield, I said. And she counted on people being too tired, too intimidated, or too isolated to fight back. The fallout came fast. The state attorney general's office launched a review of HOA enforcement powers. several other communities came forward with similar stories. A law was drafted requiring all HOA boards to register with the state and submit to annual audits. Our neighborhood. We kept rebuilding. The 7 homes Karen's holding company had taken were returned to the original owners where possible. 2 families had already moved out of state and chose to sell, but the community raised funds to help pay off their legal fees. The others came back, some with tears, some with quiet disbelief. We held a neighborhood vote and officially renamed the HOA No More Oak Terrace Estates Homeowners Association. From now on, we were the Oak Terrace Neighborhood Council. No fines, no private enforcement. Just a group of residents working together, using volunteers and simple majority votes for decisions. The cameras in the clubhouse stayed, not for spying but for transparency. Every meeting was recorded, archived, and open to the public. One evening, I sat on my porch watching the sun dip behind the rooftops. A boy rode by on a scooter, laughing. His dad jogged behind him, waving a forgotten backpack. The air smelled like charcoal and fresh grass clippings. Patris walked across the street and handed me a folder. "What's this?" I asked. "Final paperwork," she said. "State just closed the case, everything's wrapped. Karen, sentenced to 7 years. Bonnie got 4. The nephew took a plea deal, 18 months and 3 years probation." I flipped through the pages, each stamped and signed in blue ink. I felt something settle in my chest, not relief exactly, something steadier. Satisfaction, maybe, or peace. She looked at me. "You ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't had those cameras all the time?" I said. "You think it's over?" I shook my head. "Not over, just balanced." "Finally." She nodded and walked back across the street. A breeze kicked up, rustling the hedge and sending a plastic wrapper tumbling across the sidewalk. I stood, grabbed it before it hit the lawn and dropped it in the bin, old habits, but this time I wasn't worried about what might follow. No envelope, no fine, no shadowy photos, just a clean yard, a quiet street, and a neighborhood that finally belonged to its people again.